Hello, 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 everybody. Greetings, greetings. Salam alaikum. And Ramadan Mubarak to all the beautiful people out there that's celebrating this beautiful Ramadan. This your girl Tiffany here, live in the Fed. So today topic I am going to be dealing with about a Fulani brother that was brought here to America. So I'm continuing with the series about Muslims in America and Islam and the Islamic history and whatnot. So, anyways, this brother was brought here to America from the Guinea area, and he was a Fulani. His name was Yarrow Mamount. So, Yarrow Mamount was brought here, and it was said to be that he passed away in his backyard in Georgetown. So, he went from being a slave to becoming an entrepreneur. So, here's the thing, of course, there's a source information stated that he was illiterate. However, but he was very fluent with Arabic, like a lot of his other counterparts that was already here in America. So I have some sources that I want to share. And also I have a book and I have a video that I'm going to play for a little bit. All right. So by the author himself. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start with the source of information, right? So if you guys don't have the book, you guys should get it. All right, so right here, the name of this book is called From Slave Ship to Harvard. All right, and it was written by James H. Johnson. All right, so it was a story about Yarrow and his descendants and his life as a slave and how he ended up in Georgetown. Now, I have some articles that's going to go through like certain chapters. So that way I won't have to like go in and highlight it. So I can show you some articles and I can read it from there. But this is the book. And if you guys want to check out the book, you can download it on, you can get it on the PDF or you can get it on Amazon, however you choose to do it. Okay. All right. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Let me go ahead and present the biography. All right. So this right here is dealing, it comes from the chapter 1 of the book, which is called From Slave Ship to Harvard, the title that I just showed you. Okay. And it says a West African Muslim slave. So let's go ahead and let's read. So Yarrow Mamount was born in West Africa in 1736 and brought to America as a slave in 1752. He was Fulani, also called Fulupe and Pulu, a nomadic people that had converted to Islam. Although the Fulani were associated with West Africa in Yarrow's time, today they may be found as far east in Africa as Sudan. They are a minority in all countries in which they live except Guinea, where they are the largest ethnic group. Okay. The Fulani were originally from what is now the country of Mali, but by the time Yarrow was born, they had migrated southward into the region known as Fouta-Djallon. The highland has been called the Switzerland of West Africa, even though the highest spot is only 4,790 feet above sea level. Fouta-Djallon received a great deal of rainfall and is the headwater for three major rivers, the Gambia, Senegal, and Niger. It was also called Senegambia historically and sometimes simply Guinea. It lies within the eastern section of today's Guinea and Senegal. All right, then it goes on to say there is more to Yarrow's name than meets the eye. The spelling of Yarrow Mamount in America would have been Yarrow Mamount in Africa. The Fulani usually consulted an Islamic holy man when a child was born for guidance in choosing a name. And Yarrow was one of several male names for a woman's fourth child. Muhammadu, a variation of Muhammad, could be selected for a boy born on a Monday. In other words, the name Yarrow Mamount tells us that he was his mother's fourth child and was born on a Monday. However, consulting a holy man was not mandatory, and Yarrow's parent may have had other reasons for choosing these names. In any event, since he went by Yarrow Mamount most of his life and used Yarrow as his last name, even though both Yarrow and Mamount were given names, this is how he would be referred to in this book. All right. So it says Yarrow would have had a Fulani surname and possibly a nickname, but neither of these is known. Okay. There were four basic surnames in Futa Jalan: Diallo, Ba, So, and Berry. Conceivably, the name Yarrow was not derived from Euro, but rather was a misheard rendering of Delao. This seems unlikely, though. Even today, surnames are infrequently used in this part of West Africa, and when they are, it is only for formalities such as financial and government records. Yarrow had a sister who was enslaved at the same time he was. Her African name is not known, but it is believed that she was known variously as Hannah, Free Hannah, and Hannah Pale in America. What is known for sure about her is that after Yarrow died, a woman named Nancy Hillman brought suit in court claiming she was entitled to inherit from Yarrow as the daughter of his sister. A judge found this to be true. For this reason, his mother is said to be Yarrow's sister and is called Hannah in this book. Although in West Africa, the concept of a sister might include a cousin or a close female friend. All right. So right here, it says Fulani Muslims as slaves. So once again, let me say this real quick. All right. Different ethnic tribes were brought here to this country. All right. Many of them were Igbo, Yoruba, Fon, Mandinka, Hausa, Bakongo, and Fulani. So more than likely, if you have a descendant that came up out the area of Guinea or Senegal, right, or Gambia area, then more than likely you have Fulani in your family. Okay, more than likely they were Muslims. All right. So let's look at the part where they talk about the Fulani slaves. Fulani Muslim as slaves. Yarrow, who was 16 at the time he was enslaved, was neither the first Fulani nor the first Muslim to be brought to America as a slave. Still, Muslim slaves were uncommon. In early America, literate men knew Shakespeare Othello and tended to think of Black Muslims in Shakespearean terms, distinguishing them from other Africans. Shakespeare Othello was not Fulani, but white Americans in colonial times did not make such fine distinction. They were intrigued by these educated Black Muslims and referred to them as Mahometans, or perhaps through Shakespeare's influence, Moors, and they tended to treat them better than uneducated slaves. In Africa, Muslims were typically the ones who owned slaves and sold them to traders for transport to America. Yes, you read that right. All right. And goes on to say the circumstances surrounding Yarrow's capture and enslavement are unknown, but they were probably similar to those of two other Muslims from Futa Jalan, whose stories are known in early June 1731. 21 years before Yarrow arrived, a Maryland attorney named Thomas Bludette was attending court in Kent County, Delaware, when he heard of one such unusual slave. Bludette was told that the slave had escaped from his owner and was being held at the jail. The local tavern doubled as the jail. So curious, Bullet went there to interview the man. He later wrote his story. All right, so of course it talks about Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, which I already did a video about him. All right. So I'm gonna skip down. And I did a story by Abdul Rahman Ibrahim Sore. All right, then going down, it says, thus, although no one recorded how Yarrow Mamount became a slave, it was probably in a fashion similar to Diallo's or Abdul Rahman. Yarrow's sister must have been brought to America on the same ship that both Yarrow and she were captured at the same time. Suggests that the capture came after a battle or by sleep, or conceivably that Yarrow's family was the loser in a power struggle. All right, so let's look at the money in transatlantic slave trade. Let's look at that for a moment. You know what? Hold on. Yeah, let's look at the money in the transatlantic slave trade. James Lowe, the captain of the Elijah, may have been a Marylander. There was a James Lowe in Talbot County, Maryland, in this period. His descendants identify him as the Elijah captain, although this cannot be said with certainty. Yet, even the captain was a Marylander. The Elijah sailed out of Liverpool. And it says the ship arrived off of Annapolis in time for this advertisement to be placed in the May 28, 1752 issue of the Maryland Gazette. Just imported in the Elijah, Captain James Lowe, directly from the coast of Africa, a parcel of healthy slaves consisting of men, women, and children, and will be disposed of on board the said vessel in Severn River on Thursday, the 4th day of June, for sterling money, bills of exchange, gold, or paper currency. All right, so again, this was a business. All right, it was business for not only just the European, but also for those Africans who owned slaves and sold them off. Okay, they were getting traded. They would sell these slaves so they can get golds, so they can get weapons, and all different type of things. Okay. It says the arrival of the Elijah would have generated a great deal of interest in Maryland colony. Ships with slaves from the Caribbean. Ships with slaves from the Caribbean islands on average stop annually at Annapolis. I'm going to read that again. Ships with slaves from the Caribbean islands on average stop annually at Annapolis. But this was first slave ship from West Africa in 9 years. The Maryland Gazette had carried an advertisement 2 years earlier, on May 16, 1750, by the same slave trader, Tasker and Loudons, a ship with Negroes co-signed to Mazur, Tasker, and Loudons, which had orders to leave the African coast by the 1st of April, is every day expected here and will dispose of her cargo in Sovereign. But there was no later advertisement announcing the ship's arrival, as was the case with the Elijah, nor does this ship show up in the transatlantic slave trade database as reaching Annapolis. It may have sold its entire cargo en route at St. Kitts and not continue on to Annapolis. Okay. All right, so it says, as the ad said, the sale took place on board the ship. This may have been because the good citizen of Annapolis objected to having a putrid smelling slave ship anchored too close to town. Even the governor's house was only a few blocks up the hill from the dock, within smelling distance. Or it may have been because the water at the wharf was not deep enough for the ship, even with its comparatively shallow draft. In a letter describing the arrival of a passenger ship from England at about this time, an Annapolis resident reported that the ship anchored a bit below the mouth of Sovereign River and the passengers transferred to a pilot boat because of high winds that day. Not even the smaller pilot boat could get to the dock, so the greeter rowed out in a canoe to meet it. Perhaps such ferry was necessary for all ocean-going ships into Annapolis. Another possibility was that Captain Lowe did not want to take the risk that slaves would see how close they were to shore and try to jump over the side in hopes of gaining their freedom. There might also have been security concern. Annapolis was a small town with about 150 homes. 200 or so slaves on the Elijah outnumbered the adult male inhabitants. But the most likely reason the slaves were not disembarked at Annapolis prior to sale was because it was common practice to sell all sorts of cargo, whether human or other, whether slaves or indentured servants, from on board the ship, so that at the end of the day, the anchor could be raised and the ship could sail with its remaining cargo to the next port. All right. So just to leave that part off right here. So I'm gonna leave this part right here. So this come from chapter 1, and it was pages, I can't remember exactly the page number, but yeah, so it was about 16 pages long. You guys can check it out from the book, and I will come back and read the information about Georgetown. But I want to show you guys something. So there's an article from the Washington Post. It's called "The Search for Yarrow Mamount." All right, so this came out on December 26, 2012. And right here it says, this historic Georgetown home. Now, this was the home. I'm going to pull up the picture. This was the home of Yarrow Mamount in Georgetown. As you can see, it's boarded up. It says, Yarrow Mamount, a free slave, once owned the land at 3324 Dent Place Northwest. He is believed to possibly be buried on the property. Okay. So it says the historic Georgetown home is said to be unsalvageable. The two-story brick house was nearly toppled when a large tree crashed into its second story as Hurricane Irene blew through the region in 2011. Now, everyone agrees it must come down. What has neighbors and historians concerned, however, isn't the loss of the house, but what may be in its backyard. Experts believe that Yarrow Mamount, a free slave made famous by a well-known 19th century painter, may be buried behind the house at 3324 Dent Place Northwest. The idea that the remains of the man who became known for his brickmaking and financial skills might be buried in Georgetown is not far-fetched. According to old land deeds, Mamount purchased the lot in the early 1800s. Several sets of remains of the neighborhood's earliest Black residents have been unearthed in the past decade. So, historians are asking, could Mamount still be on his land? And then it goes on to say, this is really exciting for African American history in the district, said Jerry McCoy, a librarian in the Peabody room of the Georgetown Public Library, where a portrait of Mamount hangs on the wall. The dead white male history that has overwhelmingly prevailed in this country has left the African American story as it pertains to Georgetown very limited. And Yarrow is one of the most fascinating figures. Mamount has become well known to local researchers over the past decades, primarily because two artists, James Alexander Simpson and Charles Wilson Peale, painted him. A portrait of Mamount by Simpson is on display at the Georgetown Library, but it is a canvas by Peale, noted for his painting of the founding fathers, that brought greater attention to Mamount. Peale's portrait, completed in the last years of Mamount's life, showing the free man turned entrepreneur with a serene smile. His gray hair peeks out from beneath a knitted cap. All right, that's a picture of him right here. That's his painting. That's Yarrow Mamount. Okay. So going further down, it goes on to say that he could read and write in Arabic, evidence that historians believe proved that he came from a wealthy Muslim family. Upon arrival in Annapolis, Mamount was sold to Beale family, whose patriarch founded Georgetown in the late 1690s. And after more than 40 years in slavery, Mamount gained his freedom. He was 60. Mamount used his brick making skills to earn money. And 4 years after he was freed, he saved enough to purchase a lot on what is now known as Dent Place. The original home was destroyed. The house that currently sits on the land was built in the late 19th century, but after Hurricane Irene took off part of the roof and caused significant water damage, the old Georgetown Board and Advisory Committee of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts determined that it couldn't be saved. Thomas LeBouc, a spokesman for the board, said members are waiting for the developer to submit plans for a replacement structure. Then it goes on to say, Falls Church-based developer Deli S. Adewale purchased the property in May. Adewale said he appreciated the interest in Mamount's remains, but he's skeptical anything will be found. Right now, a lot of people are interested and excited about the property, but I have doubts about whether or not he's really buried there. Adewale said, I'm Muslim myself, so it's kind of intriguing to me, but it's just a lot of speculation for now. We have to be patient and see what happens. Adewale has agreed to allow a search for Mamount to go forward. All right. And then it goes on down here. Ruth Tricali, the district's archaeologist, visited the property on Veterans Day and plans to start a preliminary excavation. So basically, they have done an excavation to find skeletal bones that belong to, or that could possibly belong to Yarrow Mamount. So they have done that. I mean, as of right now, I mean, I can't go on to find out more information about that because I want to be able to get through this video. But I'll do that some other time or something. But anyways, yeah. So they were on his property, the property that he lived on, and they suspected that maybe he was buried in his own backyard. Now today, you can't do that. You can't just bury somebody in the backyard unless you get permission to do so. But back then, maybe it was permissible to bury somebody. Maybe that's what he wanted in the will. Who knows? But there's a lot more information about that. Anyways, so let's go ahead and play the video from the author named James Johnson, who wrote the book From Slave Ship to Harvard. So he goes in and explains why he wrote the book. All right, give me a moment.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
That's a story of race in America.
Write this book, he said he had seen James Alexander Simpson's portrait of Yarrow that is in the Georgetown library, and that the Peel portrait used on the cover.
All right, so this video that I posted comes from the Library of Congress, right? And which is at Georgetown area. So the author did the lecture over at Georgetown, and he explained why he wrote the book and what was the reason. So the author the person that's going to be speaking, his name is James Johnson. That's the author of the book that I showed you all. So let me go back to the video.
He just wondered who this man was to have been get two portraits at the time. I just wanted him and you here. Just to let you know, the program is being webcast for inclusion on the library's website. So when you ask questions, just know the back of your head at the very least will be on the camera. So if you have an issue with that. So I just want to welcome him.
Thank you, Ellen. And we had the Pope knock this out last fall and the snowstorm in January, so I'm glad that we have a chance to talk at the Library of Congress. And I thank you all for coming. Ellen sort of stole my thunder, because what I'm going to do today is talk, first of all, why I wrote the book, because I think people want to know that. And secondly, I'm going to go through the book. And the book, I intended the book as a story of race in America. It's more than just this man or this family. And as we go through it, you'll see that it's a story of race in America. But it started here at the Georgetown Library, which you all may know. And I was in what was then the Peabody Room before the fire. And this actually was a photograph taken at the time, the day I was there and discovered the portrait. And you look across that room and you see on the wall this portrait of a black man. And that's up close of it. And at the bottom right, the label said, Yarrow Mamount, James Alexander Simpson, 1823. And I thought, you don't think of Georgetown as a place for African Americans, and that sort of intrigued me, plus just the portrait itself intrigued me. So I went home, as we all do now, and Googled Yarrow Mamount, and saw this portrait by the great Charles Willson Peale. And this is obviously a much more artistic portrait of Yarrow. And a friend of mine is the director of the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, and I said, you know this portrait? She said, no, but any portrait of an African American prior to the Civil War is rare, and you have two of the same man, so you might do something about it. And it took me 8 years to do something about it and write this book. And that's the story I'm going to tell you now. You have to start. It's race in America, so you have to start in 1634. And that's when the Ark and Dove brought the first Europeans to Maryland. And this is these two ships coming. And Lord Baltimore was the proponent of the Maryland colony. And he said to the colonists, there were 150 on these two ships, he said, when you get to America, you have to remember there's nothing there. Everything you need has to come from England. Utensils, saws, nails, hammers, metal, fabric, sugar, wine, anything you want that's manufactured or can't be raised there, you have to import. And therefore, you need something to pay for that. You have to do something in America that you can pay for all these imports. And there's a lot of riches there. There's fur, you can raise crops, you can do logs, you can do pitch, tar, you can do all sorts of things. One thing you shouldn't do, though, the one thing you shouldn't do is what the Virginians have decided to do, and that is to raise tobacco. Because the Virginians at the Jamestown colony discovered that a man could work for a year and he could make 6 times more with tobacco than anything else he did. And so this tobacco mania took over Virginia. And the Marylanders quickly learned that yes, indeed, tobacco was the best thing, and that is why they developed this system of agricultural factories called plantations, where they needed cheap, unskilled labor to work. They first got it from convicts and indentured servants from the Great Britain, and eventually slaves from Africa. And that's how slavery got started, all because of this one plant. To get tobacco to England, that's the trick, is to get it to England. So when you grow it, they would pack it into these, what were called hogsheads. And this is one technique shown on this, is they just roll it down. But if you roll it more than 10 miles, it ruins the tobacco. As a result of that, all the settlements, all the plantations in Maryland and Virginia were within 10 miles of some body of water where they could roll these hogsheads down, load them on a skiff, and then float them to a port where they could be transported to England. The net effect of that. I'm not sure if this is a Library of Congress map of 1795. I think it may be in the Maryland State Archives. But you can look at this map of Maryland and you see the bodies of water. And I've marked on there with those little logos, little labels, the ports. And these were the deep water ports where a sailing ship could come into a harbor. And those were the tobacco ports. So you had to bring the tobacco down to those ports where it would be reloaded onto an ocean-going ship. But the net effect of all of that was that in the Maryland and Virginia colonies, all the people, the economies were all based within 10 miles of a body of water. So that's what happened throughout this area. Here on the Potomac, they kept moving this plantations farther and farther west, and north and west, up the Potomac, until it came to a spot right here where you're looking at. I took this photograph. There's a 40-foot deep hole in the Potomac River, and it's deep enough for a sailing ship to anchor there and not roll over. And that became the last tobacco port on the Potomac River. Here's another picture of it. It's the Kennedy Center, and the port is Georgetown, and that creek was Rock Creek. And Georgetown was the last port on the Potomac River for tobacco. And I say that in terms of the history and race because the reason they put the capital here was it was just east of Georgetown, so that the fact that we're all in Washington, D.C., we owe to tobacco, and the fact that we have African Americans in great numbers in the United States is all because of tobacco. Now with that, let me start turning to Yarrow's story. So you sort of have the background for why we had slavery in America and why we're here in Washington, D.C. talking about it. There's a man here called Christopher Lowndes, L-O-W-N-D-E-S. And he and his 3 brothers and his son were involved in this transatlantic slave trade. And that's the big kind of slave trade. In fact, they were the second largest slave traders, transatlantic slave traders in what is now the United States. And this is his house. It's over here just about 3 miles from us in Bladensburg. It's called Bostwick, and that's where he lived. This house, and it's still there, was built with money from the slave trade. Christopher Lowndes, there's a thing called the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. It's a very, very rich resource where they went and got all the ships they could conceive of that were in the slave trade and compile them with the owners, the ship names, and etc. I went through that and got this slide. These are the ships the Lowndeses owned or participated in. Christopher Lowndes, and he had a brother in Liverpool, which was the English center of the slave trade, and he had a brother on St. Kitts, which was a switching point on the slave trade. And they had 9,600 slaves brought to the New World, second largest slave traders in America, right here in Washington, D.C. His son, Francis, actually captained these 3 ships. And, you know, that's, if you talk about evil or lack of morality, actually captaining a slave ship, sailing it over to Africa, picking the slaves up and bringing them here sort of is the pretty high up in the scale of immorality in my view. So his son Francis actually captained these 3 ships. Now, again, the reason I tell you this is because you're a Washington crowd. If you go over to Georgetown and look at Tudor Place, that house was built by Francis Lowndes. The 2 wings on this house, the center section was built by a later owner. So that the fancy Tudor Place in Georgetown that we all think of as Georgetown is such a Tony place, was a lot of it was built with the slave trade money. In fact, this man, Benjamin Stoddard, married Christopher Lowndes' daughter, Francis Lowndes' sister. And the reason Benjamin Stoddard, I mention him, is because he was the first Secretary of the Navy under John Adams. So the slave trade went very high up in the government of the United States, with the first Secretary of the Navy being an in-law of the slave traders that brought Yarrow Mamount over. The kind of ship they used was this, a snow, or S-N-A-U, but it's pronounced snow, 2-masted, shallow draft. That has a great advantage to them. I call these the Federal Express of the slave trade because you could sail this ship up a river of Africa And people would flag the ships down and say, we've got slaves for sale. And the captain would stop and he'd buy maybe 5 slaves here or 10 slaves there. And this was an ideal ship for that. And then when he came across the Atlantic, of course, if you were a slave, it wasn't very good because it rolled a lot. And I'm going to talk about what conditions were like. But when he got to America, he could go up those same rivers I showed you in the Chesapeake Bay, the Potomac River, and go up to the plantations themselves. If we all here know Mount Vernon, and you've looked at Mount Vernon, you know what Mount Vernon looks like. These slave ships would sail right up to the dock at Mount Vernon and try to sell slaves to Washington or his overseers. And then in the end, if they hadn't sold their, quote, cargo, they would go to the big cities like Annapolis or Baltimore and try to sell the rest of the cargoes. But the idea was not to transport the slaves in wagons or on foot, but to transport them by ship from Africa directly to the plantations in America. A slave ship captain described the slave ships this way. Speaking of the slaves, their lodging rooms below the deck are sometimes more than 5 feet high and sometimes less, and this height is divided towards the middle. For the slaves lie in 2 rows, one above the other, on each side of the ship, close to each other like books upon a shelf. I have known them so close that the shelf would not easily contain one more. Cramped for want of room, they are likewise in irons for the most part, both hands and feet, and 2 together, which makes it difficult for them to turn or move, to attempt either to rise or to lie down without hurting themselves or each other. My intent here is not to make the slavery look very good. I mean, this is just terrible conditions. And this was written by a slave ship captain at the time Yarrow came over, roughly at the time, 1750. Yarrow came in 1752. So these are the conditions on those ships. Now, I've said that this is a story of race in America, and the reason I also like to quote this man, it's John Newton. He was a captain of a slave ship, but after 3 voyages to America, he couldn't stand it anymore, and he became a minister in England. And you may have heard of John Newton because he wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, and that's why that hymn is associated with civil rights, because it's written by a man who turned from being a captain of a slave ship to an advocate in England to abolish the slave trade, and they did under his pressure. Now, I'm going to get to Yarrow. He was a Fulani Muslim, and the Fulanis started in Mali, that yellow country, and at the time he came, they were moving militarily into West Africa, Senegal, and Guinea on the West African coast. And the Fulani were educated. They had European weapons. They had discipline. And so when they moved into these countries, of course, there were indigenous people that didn't like the Fulani coming in. And so there was warfare. And this period of warfare lasted quite a while. But the net effect was when the Fulani won, as they usually did, they would take their enemy as prisoners of war and would sell them to the slave ships. So that's how the slave ships got cargo. Now, of course, sometimes the Fulani lost. And when they did, they got sold to the slave ships. The slave ship captains didn't care. As long as the people were black, they were buying them as slaves and taking them to America. But that's how we ended up with educated Fulani Muslims in the slave trade.
All right, so that's the author of the book called Slave Ship to Harvard, and basically he's breaking down what inspired him to write the book. And as you know, as he mentioned, where the Fulani were very high, educated, whatnot, and many of them, they owned slaves, and when they had wars with other tribal groups or whatnot, if those other tribal groups lost to them, then they were the ones that got sold to the Europeans. But if someone in the Fulani, or if there's people in the Fulani that loses a war, then they got sold off to the European. So it was the tribal wars they had in their countries. Okay, the reason why many Africans were sold into slavery. And then, but here's the flip side to it. Even those who own slaves, right, or was a descendant or a relative of somebody that was a slave owner, or that was some type of someone who had some type of power in the country, whether they was king or queens or whatever, they too were snatched up by Europeans and brought to America. So chances are you're not only a descendant of those who were war criminals and who lost wars with other tribes, but you also could be a descendant of those who sold slaves as well. So our history is very complex when we dig into it, especially when we talk about slavery. So it's a subject that you have to dig into, like you have to go into further details and get more information. And you have to gather up a lot of information too. You can't just look at it from just one source and then that's just it. It's a lot more to it than what we thought was. It's more to it than just the Europeans. It's more to it than just the Africans. You know what I'm saying? It was not only an economic thing, but it was a war thing too. It was to show their enemy, hey, we beat you. Now that we beat you, we have the right to sell you. Okay? And that's what they did. They sold their enemies over to the Europeans just so they could earn profit. Now, and then again, you had those who were not enemies that were sold over. And you had those who were in the royal family that got taken away from their own family. So it's very complex. It's really a lot to go into details about. Anyways, I just want to end this video right here. So make sure you guys check out my other contents on here. Make sure you guys check out the other videos and share and subscribe to the channels and whatnot. So I just wanted to end it here because I got stuff I gotta do, and then also I'm gonna come back later on to do another video about another individual named Theophilus A. Thompson, who was a chess player, and he wrote a book about playing the game of chess. So I'm gonna come back and do a video about him later on. But anyways, with that being said, I'm logging off, and I thank you for those of you that were watching. And again, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell and share the channel and all the great stuff. And also make sure you check out Team Osiris. Check out Brother Malik Kamara and Brother Carlos. They have their own channel called the Old Descendant of Mali. Yeah, it's called, wait a minute, it's called Descendant of Old Mali, excuse me. That's the name of it. Descendant of Old Mali. Make sure you check out the channel. They get into great content about African history. They go into more about African spirituality and whatnot. So whatever I did not cover on here on my channel is also on their channel. You can look it up for yourselves. But also make sure you check out Team Osiris. Shout out to Brother Ngozi, Brother Consul, and many others who was out there doing things. Until then, y'all have a good one, all right? Peace and power and elevation be to all of you. This your girl Tiffany, and I'm logging off. And Salam Alaikum, Ramadan Mubarak. Be safe during this pandemic. And I hope everybody that is fasting is taking it easy. Do as much as you can. If you can't continue your fast, drink plenty of water, whatever you got to do. But other than that, just take it easy on yourself, all right? Until then, I'll talk to y'all later. Peace.